Wives, money, power, what wouldn't King Henry VIII do for each of these things? Let's waste no time and dive right into the top 10 repulsive things King Henry VIII did that you never knew about. Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have the Eltham Ordinances. Gather round, history enthusiasts, for a tale of palace intrigue, power plays, and good old-fashioned cost-cutting. Set against the backdrop of the resplendent Tudor court, we bring to you the story of the Eltham Ordinances of 1526. Now, at first glance, the Eltham Ordinances might sound like one of those mundane, bureaucratic reshuffles. Picture King Henry VIII, draped in his finest robes, going, you know what, let's tidy things up a bit and save some pennies while we're at it. But there was so much more bubbling beneath the surface. While Henry was indeed keen on streamlining his royal household, because who doesn't love an efficient monarchy, there were some ulterior motives afoot, and unfortunately for Catherine of Aragon, those motives directly targeted her and her entourage. You see, Catherine was Spanish royalty, and she brought with her a retinue of Spanish attendants. These folks weren't just there to serve her, they were symbols of her power, her influence, and her strong connection to the Spanish court. By 1526, however, Henry's affections for Catherine were waning, and he was on the lookout for ways to clip her wings. So, under the guise of reform, the Eltham Ordinances cunningly packed a 1-2 punch. First, it ousted many of Catherine's Spanish attendants, and second, it subtly pushed Catherine to the sidelines, eroding her standing and influence at court. As the ink dried on the Eltham Ordinances, the message was clear. Henry's commitment to Catherine was on shaky ground, and the great wheels of change were beginning to turn. And as history would soon show, this was just the beginning of these seismic shifts that would rock the Tudor dynasty. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Holy Maid of Kent. Among the pantheon of historical figures who dared defy Henry VIII, few were as audacious and enigmatic as Elizabeth Barton, the famed Holy Maid of Kent. Elizabeth wasn't just another nun in the tapestry of English history, she claimed a direct line to the heavens, experiencing visions and prophecies that drew a growing number of devoted followers. And while visions of saints and divine messages were not uncommon in those days, what set Elizabeth apart was the audacity of her revelations. When she threw shade on Henry's decision to kick Catherine of Aragon to the curb and replace her with Anne Boleyn, she wasn't just gossiping, she was challenging the very foundation of the king's personal and political ambitions. As word of her prophecy spread, Elizabeth became a beacon of hope for those who were none too pleased with Henry's drastic religious reforms. But as her star rose, so did the eyebrows of the Tudor court. Henry and his cronies couldn't simply dismiss Elizabeth as a delusional nun, her influence had grown too vast. To the king, she wasn't just a religious anomaly, she was a political threat. Soon enough, the hammer came down. Elizabeth was arrested and, under pressure, confessed that her divine hotline was in fact a fabrication. Whether this confession was genuine or extracted under duress remains a topic of debate. Regardless, in 1534, the once revered Holy Maid of Kent met her tragic end, executed for treason. In our number 8 spot today, we have the Act of Supremacy. In 1534, King Henry VIII, in a spectacular display of "I want what I want and I want it now," decided he was done taking orders from the Pope. Why wait for a middleman in Rome when you can just crown yourself the head honcho of the Church of England, right? With a flourish and probably an exaggerated royal proclamation, Hank declared himself the supreme head of the church, and just to make sure everyone got the memo, he made it treasonous for anyone to say, "I think the Pope's still in charge." But here's the rub. Not everyone was on board with Henry's DIY approach to religion. Monks, nuns, and some seriously devout Catholics were like, I don't know. They held on to their beliefs, and unsurprisingly, Henry's reaction to this was not exactly understanding or tolerant. Those who dared defy his self-declared religious supremacy found themselves on a fast track to persecution. Think imprisonments, property seizures, and yes, many a grim appointment with the executioner's axe. So as the dust settled on this dramatic chapter of English history, the landscape was forever changed. A king with an inflated ego, a church turned on its head, and many martyrs who paid the ultimate price for their beliefs. In our number 7 spot today, we have the Dissolution of the Monasteries. Now, picture England from 1536 to 1541, a land filled with ancient abbeys, quiet convents, and solemn monks chanting away in secluded priories. These weren't just places of worship, but treasured storehouses of art, knowledge, and, oh yes, loads of gold and precious artifacts. Enter King Henry VIII, a monarch with an appetite for power and wives, more on that later. He was always on the lookout for a quick buck, and when he saw the potential gold mine in these religious establishments, he wasn't about to let monkish piety stand in his way. So with a sweeping wave of his royal hand, and perhaps with visions of grand feasts and more velvet tunics, Henry commanded the wrecking of not 10, not 100, but over 800 monasteries, convents, and friaries. Imagine the scene: ancient stones toppling, once hallowed halls echoing with the clang of soldiers' armor, and precious relics once kissed by pilgrims going up in smoke and being carted off to royal vaults. And how about the monks and nuns? Thousands found themselves suddenly without a home, turfed out of their sacred spaces like last week's bread. Their peaceful lives of prayer and service were disrupted, to say the least. So the next time you're wandering through England and stumble upon the romantic ruins of an old abbey, remember it's not just centuries of time you're looking at, but the legacy of a king who knew how to throw a 5-year-long wrecking party, all in the name of power and coin. In our number 6 spot today, we have the treatment of his wives. Henry is probably the most famous for his wives and the treatment of it, so it's time that we dove into that a little bit at our halfway mark. Catherine of Aragon, who we spoke about a little bit earlier, a Spanish princess with devout Catholic roots. She was Henry's first wife and the mother of Queen Mary I. After 23 years and a quest for a male heir that turned into an infamous annulment saga, Henry split from both Catherine and the Catholic Church. Next up, we have Anne Boleyn, the seductive and savvy courtier who made Henry rethink his entire religious affiliation. With eyes that sparked the English Reformation and a wit to match, Anne gave birth to the future Queen Elizabeth I. Sadly, she lost Henry's affections and, subsequently, her head. Next, we have Jane Seymour, the gentle, calming antidote to the very tumultuous Anne. She did what neither of her predecessors could: bore Henry a son, Edward VI. Unfortunately, she died shortly after childbirth, but not before securing her spot as Henry's, quote, favorite wife. She's the only one buried next to him. Next, we have Anne of Cleves, billed as the 16th century version of a blind date gone wrong. Arranged to marry Henry based on a portrait, their union was short-lived when he found her less attractive in person. This is real history, I couldn't make this up. Still, they parted on good terms and she lived a comfortable life as the king's beloved sister. Kinda weird. Next, we have Catherine Howard, the vivacious teenager with a very scandalous past. Youthful and energetic, she brought some zest back into Henry's life, but her previous affairs caught up with her, leading to yet another tragic beheading. And finally, we have Catherine Parr, the mature and nurturing final act in Henry's matrimonial play. More nurse than queen, she cared for an aging and ailing Henry and outlived him, proving that perhaps the 6th time's the charm. So while Henry's love life might have made for a tantalizing court gossip, it's clear his wives bore the brunt of his whims and fantasies. Their stories remind us that behind the glitz and glamour of the Tudor crown were real women facing very real challenges. In our number 5 spot today, we have the execution of Thomas Cromwell. Thomas Cromwell, the original fixer, the 16th century equivalent of that friend who always has a guy for everything. He climbed the ranks to become King Henry's right-hand man, and for the time everything was peachy. From the shadows, Cromwell pulled the strings, masterminding moves that reshaped England itself. But every puppeteer's show has a finale. Enter Anne of Cleves, as we just covered, the king's 4th wife. She's a German princess and Cromwell thinks, hey, she'd be perfect for Hank. So Cromwell, doing the old world equivalent of a blind date setup, arranges the royal marriage. But when Henry clasps eyes on Anne, it's less than love at first sight. Apparently her portrait might have had that 16th century Photoshop touch. So what does a king do when his trusted wingman sets him up on the most awkward blind date in history and he's now married to her? If you guessed behead the matchmaker, you're thinking like a Tudor monarch. Poor Cromwell goes from VIP to RIP faster than you can say divorce. Arrested and with accusations of treason thrown his way, Cromwell soon found himself at the wrong end of the executioner's axe. So let this be a lesson in the dangerous dance of Tudor politics. One misstep, like say a mismatched royal marriage, could cost you your head. Literally. In our number 4 spot today, we have Margaret Pole. Enter Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury. Now, before you imagine a frail old lady knitting in a rocking chair, let me set the record straight. Margaret was a tough cookie. With royal blood flowing through her veins, she wasn't just any old countess. But in the treacherous game of Tudor politics, blue blood doesn't always act as an armor. Now, Margaret managed to reach the ripe old age of 67, a feat in itself in those days. But instead of getting a gold watch and retiring in the countryside, she got a date with the executioner. In short, this all tied back to politics, her noble lineage, and her perceived threat to the Tudor dynasty. And in a cringeworthy twist, her beheading was more amateur hour than swift and professional. It took several clumsy blows before the poor countess was finally granted her exit ticket from Henry's mad world. So next time you're diving into the juicy tales of Tudor England, spare a thought for Margaret Pole and the many others who met their end at the hands of an executioner, proving that in Henry's court, even the lesser known characters had starring roles in some of history's goriest dramas. In our number 3 spot today, we have the Pilgrimage of Grace. Northern England, 1536. As the chill of autumn creeps in, another storm is brewing, but this one has nothing to do with the weather. The North is buzzing, not with the latest trends in Tudor fashion, but with outrage over Henry's religious U-turns and his let's knock down some monasteries approach. Enter the rebels. Calling their movement the Pilgrimage of Grace, these folks weren't just out for a leisurely stroll. Thousands of them rallied against the king's reforms, demanding a return to the good old days. Picture angry monks, furious nobles, and a whole bunch of peasants waving banners and medieval pitchforks. Now, King Henry, ever the diplomat, and by diplomat I mean guy who really doesn't want a massive revolt on his hands, decides to parlay. Okay, disband, go home, and all will be forgiven. Alright, let's just clear the slate. The rebels, thinking that they've just won, happily head home, but plot twist. Henry pulls the oldest trick in the monarch's playbook, the old bait and switch. Instead of peace and pardons, many of the rebellion's leaders got a one-way ticket to the chopping block. Moral of the story, in Tudor England, if King Henry VIII promises you something, maybe don't be too quick to take him at his word. After all, actions definitely speak louder than words, especially when the action is a date with the executioner, alright? In our number 2 spot today, we have the exploitative laws. King Henry VIII, the cunning monarch with an insatiable appetite for power, wives, and as we're about to discover, other people's wealth. Enter stage right, a set of deviously clever laws. These weren't just your regular tax reforms or trade policies. Oh no, these laws gave the crown the power to snatch up the properties of those who died without heirs. Seems straightforward, right? But here's where the plot thickens. You see, this law often danced a macabre tango with charges of treason. If a nobleman, or really any unlucky soul, was accused of treason and met the grim fate of the executioner, they often left behind vast lands and treasures. With the charges of treason hanging over their head, any direct heirs were often disinherited. And with the new laws in place, guess who had first dibs on all of these abandoned riches? You got it, our man Henry and his gleeful council. So with a master stroke, the Tudor monarch could silence his opponents and seize their wealth, all while giving it the veneer of legality. In the grand game of power, Henry played his cards with ruthless efficiency, ensuring that dissent was not only quashed, but also turned profitable for the crown. And finally, in our number 1 spot today, we have the Carthusian monk's execution. The Carthusians weren't your everyday monks. These fellows were like the elite athletes of the religious world. Renowned for their unwavering commitment to their faith and their austere lifestyle, they were looked up to as the spiritual heavyweights of England. Their devotion was so fierce that even the ordinary folks whispered their names in reverence. But as the wind of religious change swept through Tudor England, these holy men found themselves caught in a storm of royal proportions. You see, King Henry, in his quest to become the supreme head of the Church of England, determined, expected every Tom, Dick, and Harry to toe the line. But the Carthusians? They weren't about to bend their beliefs, not even for the king. And so, as these monks stood firm, refusing to recognize Henry's supremacy over the Pope, they essentially painted a target on their backs. Their defiance was met with Henry's notorious wrath. In 1535, in a horrifying display of power and cruelty, 3 priors were subjected to the gruesome fate of being hanged, drawn, and quartered, a grisly warning to any who dared to challenge the crown. But the persecution didn't end there. As the years rolled on, more monks faced the king's fury. Some met the sharp edge of the executioner's axe, while others were thrown in the kingdom's darkest dungeons, left to wither away in a slow dance of hunger and despair. Through it all, the Carthusians' steadfastness in the face of such brutality became the stuff of legends. Their tale stands as a testament to the lengths people will go to uphold their beliefs, even when pitted against the mightiest of kings. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thanks so much for checking it out. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and maybe I'll see you again soon. I don't know. Bye!